Welcome to the panel. These are my panelists, and we're going to start with Samantha, and I'll just introduce all of them first. Samantha Stevenson is an assistant professor in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara, where she studies climate change impacts on the tropical Pacific and drought in the Southwest U.S. using a combination of ocean and climate models, field observations, and paleoclimate proxy reconstructions. Then after Samantha, and I may have a problem here because these are three women who have three-syllable names and they all start with S, so I feel like I'm going to stumble over somebody's name. Anyway, the next panelist is Stephanie Pinsel, who is a professor and founding director of the Center for Sustainable Communities at the UCLA Institute of the Environment. She conducts research on cities, how they impact resources far and near, such as energy sources and energy distribution systems, and how such resources are used in cities, where, by whom, and to do what. She has created the first ever interactive energy web atlas that describes building energy use in Southern California and the San Francisco Bay. And then our third panelist joining us by Zoom is Susana de Anda. She is the co-founder and executive director of the Community Water Center, which has offices in Sacramento, Visalia, and Watsonville. Susana is a seasoned community organizer whose experience includes planning and organizing positions at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, the County of Merced Planning Department, the Santa Barbara County Water Agency, and the Santa Barbara Nonprofit Community Environmental Council. And Susana is also a co-founder and member of the board of Water Education for Latino Leaders. Okay, so we'll start with Samantha, who's going to give a very broad picture of what's going on with drought. So I guess the first question to ask, which never occurred to me until I read your bio and all that, is how do you define drought, and how do you know when it's over?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I'm not going to be able to provide a single answer because there kind of isn't one, right? And even people who study drought for a living disagree on exactly what definition of drought is appropriate for whatever context. So I guess I wanted to start just by kind of providing some of the categories of drought definitions that are often used, and there's a lot of them even there, but like kind of some of the more commonly used categories are meteorological drought. So you can think about drought as just like a lack of rainfall, right? So is the amount of rain falling lower than average, right? So that would be kind of a meteorological drought. So all you're thinking about is the amount of rain, right? But sometimes, if you're a farmer, that's not the full picture, right? So you really want to know something about, is the amount of moisture that's available, is that reduction enough to really cause a decrease in the amount of plant growth, right? So those are kind of like agricultural types of drought definitions, right? And then the third broad type is hydrological, which is not specific to plants, but they're thinking about the integration of moisture in the soil surface, right? So you can kind of think about like the soil as a bucket that holds water, and so you're adding some when it rains, and you're also losing moisture both through action of plants, they kind of breathe just like us, and evaporation from the soil surface. So there's kind of like some categories of drought definitions, but you also have to think about even within that, what kind of space and time average you're worried about. Like, are you concerned about drought at a particular place, like at in Santa Barbara County? Or are you worried about a drought that spans the entire western U.S., right? Or what time scale is important? So in certain places, like particularly if it's wet in general, then a drought that lasts for only a couple of years can be pretty devastating. Whereas somewhere like California, we're kind of used to it, not raining for months on end, right? So that's why it's really hard to define a precise, there's not like a one-size-fits-all definition of drought. That said, you're asking like how you know when it's over, right? And that also becomes really tricky, because, and I just wanted to kind of prime people, because I know we're going to be talking about climate change later on. And so typically when you think about a drought ending, you're thinking about like, well, we know what's normal, and then we know what's like worse than normal, whether that's rainfall or total moisture loss or what have you. But then, you know, you're in a drought when there's less, and then the drought ends when you come back to what you thought was normal, right? But because of climate change, we're actually, and like this is what we work on in my group, is trying to use these big computer models to try to see what is in store for the future of drought and simulations. And one thing we're finding is that there's not, like, normal is changing all the time, right? So we have these trends in the amount of moisture that's available in the western US. And so, you know, it's kind of going down all the time. And so, you know, even if that wasn't happening, you'd come back to normal, right? But now the idea of what is normal is drier than it was before, right? And so I think it's becoming trickier to determine when a drought ends, but I think we're gonna have to take into account the effect of climate change on this, you know, what we expect if a drought wasn't happening. Makes sense. Yeah.
And how long has drought been an issue on the West Coast?
Yeah, so I mean, forever, as far as we can tell, right? So that one's, you know, we have some evidence for, you know, the amount of, like, so drought has been a problem as long as there's been people on the West Coast that have relied on water, right? So for the past 100 years, so as we've been populating the West Coast, we've seen significant droughts, say in California. Like, you can look up, you know, historical events which have taken place, you know, in the 2010s, kind of earlier on, the 80s, 90s, and so on. But even before that, there's ways of reconstructing what the climate variability used to be. So that's this idea of paleoclimate. So when in our best estimates of the history of the climate, there's always been drought, right? So there's variation in the amount of water that's been available, and you can get droughts that last even for not just 5 years, but for 10, 20, or 30 years. And that seems to have happened just, you know, periodically from natural variations in the climate for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years. And there's some evidence also to indicate that those really long droughts in the past were so bad that they actually caused, you know, prehistoric civilizations to relocate, right? So, you know, you can see like settlements of Native Americans and so on that seem to have been abandoned around the time when the climate reconstructions indicate that there were significant droughts. So as far as we can tell, this has always been a problem. It's just now we're adding on the dimension of climate change, where we have these drying trends, and we have many, many more people living here than we ever had in the past. So the impacts of the drought are becoming worse, but drought is just a feature of the climate.
And so how have I read that the last 22 years have seen the worst drought in 1,200 years.
Mm-hmm.
So how do aside from, fossil fuel emissions and climate change, how have other human activities made the drought worse?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think you're referring to a study that came out earlier this year, which, was done by researchers at UCLA, actually. It's kind of exciting. So that's kind of saying, like, we can take this long-term view of drought, and we have these climate reconstructions, so we can kind of estimate what the history of drought has been. We have about 1,200 years worth of data. That's where that 1,200-year number comes from. But I suspect that if we had 1,500 years or 2,000 years worth of climate data, then we'd be sitting here saying the drought now is the worst in 2,000 years, right? So there's nothing magical about the 1,200. That's just, the length of time we've been able to reconstruct things. So I guess the question is, like, how have humans made this worse? And so I mentioned that you can think about drought or the soil, right, as being kind of like a bucket to hold water. In California and in most of the western US, the amount that we're adding to that bucket has not changed a huge amount. So, like, the amount of rainfall isn't changing all that much. Like, there's, natural variations, but human activities don't seem to be having like a huge impact on the amount of rainfall right now, although there's issues with, it's also changing, like, the sequencing of rainfall and things like that. Anyway, you can think about the reason why human activities are making drought worse as loss from that bucket. So we're warming up the land surface in most places around the world, but particularly in the western US, that effect is winning over the amount of water that we're adding to that soil from rainfall. So that heating effect is causing the droughts that have occurred to be hot droughts. So this is actually like the hottest drought that we've seen recently, which is why it's associated with such a significant loss of moisture. So I guess we asked what non-greenhouse gas emission effects have had on drought, and I think when you think about this particular drought, it really is greenhouse gases that are the winner because of this heating of the land surface. That's not to say that we're doing other things too, right? So changes in land use patterns can be important. So there was a drought in the Midwest, the Dust Bowl drought in when was that, the 30s, I think. And so there's some evidence to show that changes in crop patterns led to changes in just the amount of dust that was launched into the air, which actually made the drought worse. So that kind of thing can matter a lot. And then also emissions of air pollution. So we call them aerosols in climate worlds, but things like emissions from coal plants and things like that actually change the pattern of cloud cover too. But my understanding is this particular drought, so you can think about the main human contribution of that just being greenhouse gas driven heating of the land surface. So, yeah.
And did you want to talk a little about projections for water scarcity in the future?
Sure. Yeah, it's always a cheerful topic, right?
Topic.
Yeah. So I guess I'm not sure if people are familiar with climate models or not. I can give a little bit of background on kind of how we generate these future projections that are used for water scarcity, but also other purposes. So you may have heard about these projections of the 1.5 degrees Celsius world versus the 4 degrees Celsius world and all of that, and that comes from projections from general circulation models or global climate models. So these are these big computer-based simulations of the entire planet where you write down equations for everything you think is happening in the world, whether it's the winds, ocean waves, the growth of plants, all of those actually go into the computer and get estimated at every place on Earth, and then they talk to each other, right? And so then you start that from somewhere, your best estimate of observations, and then you say, okay, this is your equations, and then this is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and other things humans are doing. What's going to happen, right? And then the computer kind of says, okay, I'm going to integrate that forwards in time. So that's basically what a climate projection is, and we've done that many, many different times with many different climate models. And we want to do that many times because there's slightly different ways to estimate things, and so you might get slightly different answers. But for the most part, all of these models agree, greenhouse gases are warming the planet, right? We're very certain that climate change is real, it's caused by us. And it's very certain that that's going to cause warming of the land surface, like I mentioned. And so that means that we're also very certain that the western U.S. is going to continue to dry if we don't do something to mitigate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So just because of that amount of loss of moisture from the land, water scarcity is going to continue to increase. So we're going to lose water from evaporation, but also from a reduction in the amount of snowpack too. So that's another thing that we're very certain of from the computer models, unfortunately. So water scarcity is going to continue to become a big issue, and we have to kind of think about that continuously in our idea of what is normal under a future of climate change is going to continuously change. So.
Okay. All right, well, that was 15 minutes of Samantha, and everybody will get a chance to, we'll have 15 minutes of questions at the end, so questions will come. So Stephanie is going to talk mostly about cities. So how does the drought ravaging agricultural areas affect our cities?
So I think it's important to, in light of the previous panel we were just part of with Indigenous knowledge, to think about the vocabulary that we're using. The question of scarcity and drought really comes from assumptions about what is normal and what is what we expect to be able to consume. So for some people who have lawns, they expect to be able to water their lawns, and that drought for them is scarcity in the water that they can use on their lawns. So I think we have to step back just a little bit, in that a lot of the science about what's normal, about the hydrologic cycle and the rest, really, and all due respect, because I work with climate modelers, we're working on a big DOE grant right now, comes out of a kind of Western European idea of how much water is normal to have and the kinds of landscapes that are normal to have. If you go to the Sahara, you don't think that you're in a drought. You realize that this is just the normal landscape. And so climate change notwithstanding, and we are certainly in the middle of a big drying and warming period, I also think we have to think much more carefully about how we use these words and what we imply with these words. What is normal? Who's normal? What normal? We know that, as you were saying, during the Middle Ages, the Western European Middle Ages, there was an enormous 300, 400 year drought. So I think we have to step back for just a second and ask ourselves what we expect our lifestyles to be able to be sustained by. And the fact of the matter is, in Los Angeles, still about half of water used in the residential sector is on outdoor irrigation. And it's, well, what do we expect to see? What's normal? Well, it has to be green, because now, of course, the word green means health, it means well-being, it means all these other things, but it also means a certain kind of landscape that actually never belonged here and is exacerbating scarcity. So what does scarcity mean? In a situation where we overexploit our resources that are available. We're not managing them carefully, we're not managing them thoughtfully. So one of the big problems in the Central Valley with agriculture, and I bet Susana has a lot to say about this, is the extraction of water from the groundwater at an incredibly egregious, unsustainable way to be able to plant more nut crops, to be able to export nut crops and make money. And so this is driven by this idea that it doesn't really matter as long as in the present, because this is a capitalist system, we are making as much money as we possibly can by exploiting the resources that exist. There's an enormous amount of water in California, excuse me. There really is a lot of water in California. And about 10 years ago, I used to joke with my husband, I said, the problem with water in California is there's just too much. He said, what do you mean there's too much water? Well, there's too much water because we've become accustomed to thinking about it as an endless resource that we don't have to actually manage well and carefully and thoughtfully. So we should, in California, agriculture, ban any more well drilling. No more new wells, period. We need to revise all of the water rights to water in agriculture, because it was the first in time, the first in right, and you have people who have not had to give up any water at all because they were there first, and the smaller, newer farmers are getting nothing. Those are the guys that bring you food at the farmers' markets, by the way, that you really appreciate. So the structure of water management in the state leads to scarcity. It's not an absolute kind of scarcity. It's an institutional, socio-technological system that is leading to scarcity. We have groundwater basins in Los Angeles that are underfilled, 800,000 acre feet in Central Basin. Why? Well, because we have a system of managing those groundwater, which are one of the few groundwater basins that are adjudicated and managed in California. There's also the one in Mojave that restricts the amount of water that can be managed in those because of the adjudications that occurred to preserve the rights and water of the people who extracted it. And new water put into it is generally conceived of as natural water that doesn't belong to anybody. So the county can infiltrate lots of water in that groundwater basin, but they don't have a right to pump it. So we have systems in place that create more scarcity than actually exists in the natural scarcity, whatever that might be, right? So a scarcity defined by, I only get 40 gallons per person per day, and I can't water my landscape, is that scarcity? As long as I have enough to drink, cook, bathe, wash my clothes, live a normal, decent life, is that scarcity? What do we expect out of this system? So I think that's a really big question. I think that in terms of agriculture, well, I'm on kind of a rant, obviously. But I think we really need to talk about these things. In terms of agriculture in California, it's a private property system where growers grow what they feel can be exported at the highest rate of return. Understandable, because the private property system in California has led to agricultural land prices being stratospheric, absolutely stratospheric. Everything is out of whack. Land prices in cities are out of whack, land prices in the agricultural area are out of whack. So what do you expect to get out of a system like that is so completely out of whack? You expect people to try to grow stuff where they're gonna make enough money to pay their property taxes or whatever costs that they have in terms of private property ownership. So I think we can't just take the water issue out of the larger context of these dynamic processes that take place. It doesn't work that way. It's a system. So if you ask farmers to reduce their water use when they have invested in planting crops that need irrigation year-round, like trees, or most of the year, they're gonna go out of business, right? If they're growing tomatoes and row crops and stuff like that, they cannot grow it for a year or two and not go out of business, right? Because they can always replant those kinds of row crops. So the agricultural system has adapted to the market dynamics that exist out there for especially the larger and larger farmers. And the consolidation of land in agriculture is unbelievable. It's just absolutely staggeringly unbelievable. So a few big farmers are really making all of these decisions, and I would argue, if you did the analysis, probably using most of the water. Well, they certainly are using most of the water. So it's not a level playing field here. So when we talk about, oh, well, the farmers should, well, there are lots of different farmers under different kinds of circumstances, under different kinds of pressures. As far as urban water use goes, we just need to get a grip and stop planting stuff that needs 30 inches of rain a year. You know, a lawn is like a pretty water intensive thing. So I think that it's a system that we need to begin to unravel very seriously, starting with water rights in the Central Valley. Completely need to be redone. We need to think about how farming has been driven by exorbitant land prices and pressures in the farm systems, so that smaller farmers, cooperatives, and so on just can't make a living growing stuff that we actually eat, not for export. We have to think about the role of California in export agriculture, which is a very difficult one because we feed most of the nation, particularly out of Imperial Valley. The lettuce that people eat in DC comes out of Imperial. The Sudan grass that goes to feed Kobe beef in Japan comes out of the Imperial Valley. You know, it's a big, big system that has been self-reinforcing over a number of decades, and it's not going to be an easy fix just to pick one piece out and say, oh, well, there's climate change and there's drought. Not to mention that a lot of these big farms really rely on a lot of very fossil fuel and fossil energy intensive inputs, right? Pesticides, herbicides, pumping water, big machinery. So if you're thinking about moving away from fossil energy, what does that mean for the agricultural sector today, right? So that's where I will stop.
Okay, yeah, and as a journalist, I just wanted to say, you know, I really love it when people I'm interviewing go off on a rant. It provides so much good material.
Mm-hmm.
I might need some help with Susana. Did you have a PowerPoint that you were going to use? Okay, so.
I do. Tell me if you can see it.
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
Are
okay.
you able to see my screen?
Great.
Yeah,
Yep.
we're good.
Okay,
Right.
now you can see the audience. Okay.
I want to move her faces in the middle of the slide there.
I
You
don't
can just
think
use
I
your
can.
cursor and move it over. I think
Yeah.
Can I move her?
you should be able to.
All right, team. Are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Great. Well, good afternoon. I'm Susana de Anda with Community Water Center. I've been working on water for over a couple of decades. I've devoted my journey on this land to ensure that we prioritize drinking water for humans. I'm a water advocate. I believe clean and affordable drinking water should be a basic human right, and that should never be a privilege. So part of my presentation is kind of to ground ourselves on what has already been happening and how a drought and an extension of a drought that never ended, how that continues to worsen already dire conditions in our communities. I also want to challenge you to think about what is your role in climate change and in climate justice. I truly believe that all of us have a responsibility, and once you know that, it's up for you to take action. So a couple of grounding. Let's see if I can move my slide. All right. Community Water Center, El Centro Comunitario por el Agua. Our mission is to be a catalyst for community water solutions through organizing, education, and advocacy in California. We believe that all human beings need to have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. The center's been working on this for a long time, mainly because we discovered California's dirty little secret, which is clean water will flow towards money and power.
Yep.
Right now, as we speak, we have over 1 million Californianos exposed to unsafe drinking water each year in their home. In the most safest place, we're finding ourselves exposed to detrimental contaminants. And I'm not talking about contaminants that don't taste good. I'm talking about contaminants that can get you sick. Things like nitrates, arsenic, 1,2,3 PCP, chromium-6, uranium, perchlorate. The list is ongoing. Many of the families that I have a luxury of working with have been living in this reality of not having safe and affordable drinking water from their tap. In addition to that, moms have to worry that their children don't swallow the water they use to brush their teeth. Moms have to worry that their children take bottled water to school, because guess what? In California, we have more schools without safe drinking water as well. The over 1 million Californianos is actually an underestimate, but it gives us enough studies and enough data to know that we have a big public health problem in California when it comes to access to safe drinking water. Here's a map that I like to show. So where is the problem? Well, we have a portal. This is the Human Right to Water. This is the Human Right to Water portal that the State Water Board has, and they need to update ever so often so we have better data. But here you can see the red dots are all the systems in California that are not providing safe and potable drinking water to residents. And what you're going to see is, well, it's throughout the entire state, but they're highly concentrated in agricultural communities where I get to work in. So we work in the Central Valley and the Central Coast. And that's where you see the heavy red stars. Now, I also want to just flag on this. It's important to recognize that when it comes to water, we have two sources of water, groundwater and surface water. You have to have water rights for surface water. That's your canals, that's your aqueduct. That kind of water, a lot of the residents that I get to work with, we don't have water rights. So we heavily rely on groundwater. And that's an important note for all of us to understand. Over 99% of Valley residents rely on groundwater for our drinking water. That's the only one we have, and that's the one we need to protect from further contamination and to ensure that it's running through the pipes. This is Berta Diaz from the community of East Rossi. She's had a struggle to ensure that we have safe drinking water in her home. She's been struggling with nitrates for over decades. Nitrates have been linked to the blue baby syndrome, kidney, and cancer. The biggest contributor to nitrate pollution is coming from agriculture, chemical fertilizer. In the Central Valley, we grow a lot of what you would call food, but I can tell you that water is food, and we need to protect our drinking water first. This is Berta. She has grandchildren now living with her, so generations are continuing to be condemned to not have safe drinking water in their home. And it's a constant stressor. I also want to highlight the reality that for the majority of our familias, they're paying at least 10% of their household income alone just to have safe drinking water. Our farm worker communities are having to pay some of the highest water rates for toxic water, over $80, $90 for water that can get you sick. And on top of that, you have to buy bottled water just to have safe drinking water in the household. You all know if you boil water with nitrates, it increases the concentration. If you boil it with bacteria, it'll eliminate the bacteria, but if you have multiple contaminants, it might increase the concentration of others. That's why we say in Espanol, we have to have conciencia. You got to be well aware of water and what's in your drinking water. The bottom line, black and brown people that look like me, have higher chances of having contaminated water and higher chances of having to pay some of the most highest water rates for toxic water that can get us sick. And it's no surprise, arsenic and nitrate contamination disproportionately impacts low-income people of color, once again. And this is important because as I get into the discussion of the drought only already adds another layer of stress to our already stressed out communities. I like to show, and I actually have the samples that you have on your screen here live with me. As a water advocate, I carry samples all the time so that you understand the reality of life. So we like to say that looks can be very deceiving because the Ducor water bottle, the brown looking one, that's actually safer to drink than the one that has nitrates from East Rosie because of the type of water contaminants that we have. Primary contaminants like nitrates are detrimental. You can get really sick if you drink that. If you drink things like manganese and sulfur, which is what we have in the brown looking water bottle, that's a secondary contaminant. It doesn't taste good, but it's not going to give you cancer. So looks can be very deceiving, team. Bottom line, a lot of our residents are exposed to water that doesn't smell like anything. That's why it's really important that we understand water quality reports. The drought. The drought only made things worse, but it also was an opportunity for media to pick up on our stories, to elevate the current conditions that we've been living in for a long time, to elevate that right now as the drought has continued from the last one, because the last one never really ended. The way that we're adjusting to the drought is inhumane. It is not okay that Simona Magaña, as you see here, had to, for over a year, go to her neighbor and fill up these water jugs, then have buckets so that she can have running water in her house to wash dishes and to flush their toilets. We have thermal conditions in California. These are conditions we don't need to adapt to. But once again, Black and brown are having to live in these kind of conditions that we, frankly, as a water advocate, that has got to change. And things are shifting. But it's important to recognize that as we talk about these stories and people's lives, it's very real to us. We've already been living in a reality where we're exposed to toxic water. The drought only made things worse. However, it also allowed us to bring in opportunities and to highlight what we want to work towards and live in a reliable California. We really believe that in order for us to secure the human right to water that was passed in 2012, we have to address fundamentals, which means we have to have sustainable groundwater. We have to protect our drinking water from further contamination, and guess what? We have to share our water for better uses, and I really believe that humans should be a priority versus cotton fields. It's also really important that we address safe and affordable drinking water. You know, a lot of our communities are having to deal with really expensive treatment with a small rate base. So that means when you bring in treatment and you divide that with a small rate base, it's very expensive. And that's happened in Fresno County where we brought in over a $2 million arsenic treatment plant and we can't use it because it's unaffordable. It's very expensive. So as we talk about water quality, we also have to understand that it's got to be affordable to drink. As part of the movement, I really believe that community power and engaged leadership is key. Bottom line, we can fix pipes, we can fix treatment, but the social infrastructure of who's running our systems is really I would say the biggest barrier to change is our human capital. With that, it's important that residents are just as engaged as decision makers. We believe that if we address all this, we can have a reliable and safe drinking water source in California. Just to give you some framework, you know, we passed the human right to water in 2012 in California. We passed it, but to this day, we're not delivering on the dream, which is all human beings deserve to have the right to access reliable source of drinking water, and we don't have that. However, this was a foundational policy that we passed, the movement passed, and we use it as the foundation for the state of California to build off better policies and better implementation so that we can have safer and affordable drinking water sooner rather than later. SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that we passed in 2014, was exactly to ensure that we would prioritize groundwater for beneficial uses so that agriculture would be forced to plan for our communities alongside our communities to ensure that we have a reliable source of water right now and for future generations. And that was the intention of this law, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The intention of that is to ensure that we prioritize drinking water for communities. However, if we don't do that right, it can be complete genocide for our communities. Right now, as we're looking at the implementation of this law and the planning around it, it's very clear that who's at the table, they're not considering drinking water needs, and that's a big problem. I also just want to highlight that as we continue to elevate this issue of drinking water, access to safe, reliable water, in the middle of the drought, it was also really important that we would target and bring in sustainable funding to alleviate our communities for interim and long-term solutions. and this was the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act that was passed in 2012, that for the next 10 years, or 9 years now, the state's going to provide $130 million only for low-income people of color communities to bring interim and long-term relief. I say this because as we work through all this, we have a drought. As we have more funding on the budget, we have a drought. As we continue to talk about reliable drinking water, right now we have people with no drinking water at all. They have no running water. And here's the fun fact, the majority of these wells that are going dry are found in the Central Valley, people of color once again. So for me, the call to action should always be, how do we prioritize resources for the already stressed out communities to be at the top of the priority so that we have better resources to be best positioned for what we know is going to be the new wave of California? We have to share water, and we have to share it for drinking water. And we have to stop this greed, and we got to stop this pollution. Now, that said, it's important to understand that we address this holistically. I work alongside farm workers. I come from a farm worker familia. And so it's not that we want to get rid of agriculture. We want to just have better policies with agriculture and better paying jobs. It's about time that farm workers have safe drinking water, too, as they produce our food as well. Background, last year we had a huge water debt, over $1 billion in water debt relief for a lot of families that couldn't pay their water bill. Again, Black and brown communities were impacted disproportionately. And it's important to once again understand this repetitive story. There's some people that always get disproportionately affected from others, and we need to raise and highlight those stories and bring about solutions and change for that, not to reinforce a narrative that doesn't help us anymore. We want to shape the California that we want to live in, which means we have to have better policies and better resources for the implementation of that. A couple of takeaways that I think it's important for all of us to be mindful of. Water is the most basic form of PPE, personal protective equipment. We're still in a pandemic. We've got to have running water. Maintaining access to drinking water has got to be a prerequisite as we can continue to recover equitably from COVID. Consideration of the human right to water should be at the forefront of all projects, all discussions, not a set-aside. The same thing with environmental justice. It's a lived experience. It's the way we look at life. It's not a topic of discussion. It's life. It's real. Community leadership is important, that is part of the solution, that we engage directly with impacted residents, to be at the table. The reason that we're in this reality, the reason that the drought continues to worsen our current conditions, was because a lot of our Black and brown communities weren't part of water planning in California. We weren't invited. So now we are part of that planning. We are part of drought relief. And we're part of good policies we want to see implemented to bring relief to our communities. Partnerships and coalitions are critical. So I reach out my call to action to you all in the room. What's in your drinking water? How can you help alleviate and bring about change around the issue of drinking water? As we talk about drought, I think it's really important that drought is just another added layer to the already dire conditions that we have. And that, I think, is also really important to understand that we have to have proactive solutions to bring about change, which means that we have to be addressing things around treatment, affordability, and water supply at the same time. And we have to stay connected so that we can empower each other. With that, I'm going to conclude. So thank you for this quick presentation.
Questions? And for any of the panelists? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. I appreciate what you said about kind of expectations about what's normal. And I have wondered a lot about that word drought, because I've talked to a lot of farmers and irrigation people from Arizona. And I think the word drought is often used to back away from climate change, because historically droughts have always ended, even if they go on for a long time and they're bad. And so I think there's a way in which drought has that sort of political connotation of, you know what, I think it's going to end. Yeah. And so I wondered about the thoughts of any of the three of you about that.
This is directed for you, so go ahead.
Well, I think you make a good point, and that we're in a regime change. And so what does drought mean when it's a regime change, right? It's as they say, a new normal, which is a kind of silly way to think about it in a way, but it does go back, I think, to this approach that we've had in the 20th century, informed by modernist thinking, that humans can overcome natural conditions through engineering. And we have the most extraordinary engineered water system in California, but what it's done is it made us forget where we are. And it also overlooked water resources that do exist and wasted them. I mean, there are lots and lots of springs in the Santa Monica Mountains here. They're all culverted and they go out to the ocean. They don't do anything for the local ecosystems. They're in the way, they flood, you know, they're a big problem. You know, we have to manage that water. We de-water garages. Beverly Hills has very high water table. We de-water that. They have to de-water it. There's so many interesting terms in water, and they put it into the storm drains. I mean, so it's a much bigger question. And I think it goes back to what Susana was talking about. Agriculture in California has not only extracted the groundwater so that communities don't have access to water, they've poisoned it too. I mean, where's the problem? It really has to do with agricultural practices, and they're completely off the hook. And so I think we have to begin to really question this modernist path that we've been on, that can scientize problems in a way that we always think that we can find a new answer through a better technology, through a better process, when in fact those better technologies and those processes have actually created a lot of the problems that exist. So the engineered water conveyance systems desiccate parts of the state, right? We know that in terms of we need the ecological returns, we keep water for ecology. I mean, it's a really complex system. We can begin to unpack it by asking the right questions.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, I don't disagree with anything you said this entire time. I think it's all this is incredibly important. I also think that we need to be rethinking all of our systems with the understanding that we are not, in a sense, climatically going to end the drought in the ways that we've been thinking about. Like, there's not really, I mean, you know, statistically, maybe every so often we'll have a sequence of wet enough years that we might think that we're, you know, back to normal, if normal is what we expected 30 or 40 years ago, but we can't count on that long term. And so any solutions or set of solutions that we decide, which, you know, absolutely should incorporate themes of environmental justice, is long overdue. But we also need to keep in mind that just the amount of water that we need to plan for is going to be kind of going down with time as well. So.
Yeah. If I may, I'd just like to add that I think it's really important to recognize that how we're adjusting to changes, they're not equitable. No. And it's really important that we talk about that, because we can sit around and have data projections and all that, and we can continue to do that. But at the same time, right now, it's a human issue. And so the more we humanize what we're working on, the more we can have more relief and more attention with families that need it now. Droughts have been happening for a long time, but drought impacts are disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities, and that's a real problem. Now for us, you know, I appreciate the question around climate change versus drought. Droughts, for our elected officials, they care because they see this immediate impact. But a lot of our elected officials where we live don't even believe in climate change. So if you don't believe in that, you're not going to put investment towards that. And that's a real problem. So I think it's really important that as we discuss changes, is that bottom line, we need to have humans having access to safe, reliable sources of drinking water. We cannot have families constantly stressed out to have, when is their well going to go dry? We can't do that. The state needs to ensure that we demand the implementation of the human right to water for all Californianos, and we're failing on that. So right now we have the resources, we have the technology. All we need is the willpower to ensure that we leverage more resources for our communities to be better positioned for what we're seeing now. And on the reverse, I have to tell you that I think water greed has got to change. When the state of California sent curtailment letters telling farmers or everyone that has access to surface water, hey, you got to use less surface water, what do you think they do? They rely on groundwater. So then they go to their second alternative of groundwater, but that's our primary drinking water source. So when you have agriculture being told don't use a lot of surface water, then they pump up groundwater, affecting our communities and causing a lot of wells to go dry too. And it all goes back to greed. It all goes back to what is it that we're using more water for? And I think during a drought, absolutely, we need to halt the exploitation of drilling wells. We're drilling some massive deep wells in our aquifers that are already at risk of never coming back and recovering. We have major subsidence in our land, which means that we have the land drops, we don't have enough capacity underground to store water. Again, groundwater is our drinking water. And so as everything has shifted, I think we have to keep, at least for me, the winning ticket is to ensure that humans have a reliable source of drinking water, more so than any production of crops, honestly. And I think it's time to ensure that farm workers, those that feed our world and provide other crops, that we also allow them to drink water at work and at home as well when they return.
Other question? Yeah.
How much is gray water being used by agriculture? And second question, what amount of our water is being used in residential watering of lawns and that kind of thing?
Well, for the gray water in agriculture, the issue is really, there is some, but the problem is where the water is consumed in large enough volumes is not really close to where the agriculture is. And so the conveyance of that water is really virtually impossible, actually, unless you want to incur huge infrastructure costs and pumping costs. This region, the Los Angeles region, is moving ahead quite a lot on water recycling. And then some of that water gets re-injected into groundwater and then gets pumped and treated. So I think that closing that loop is becoming much more prevalent in urban areas, and I know that in this region, there's a lot more willingness to do that now that we finally defeated toilet to tap, which was like in the, like 2012, maybe 2010 or so, there was this big campaign, oh, we can't recycle sewage water because it's toilet to tap, which was like, they built, anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole. So I think that gray water is, water recycling is important, but as we reduce the amount of water we use, we have less water to recycle, which is this funny paradox, right? I would say that the water use per capita in the region really varies by wealth. That's really the biggest indicator of water consumption and size of property. So if you drive around Bel Air and right behind here, you know, people will be using probably over 100 gallons per person per day. If you go to East LA or South LA, they'll probably be using like 40 gallons per person per day, if that. So there's no kind of, there are averages, but that's the important point to remember, is if you can afford it, you will, going back to Susana's point, it's just a bill. You know, it doesn't have any connection to water as this essential element for well-being and survival. So what I say is the water you use on your lawn is the water you're not going to be able to drink. And that's actually factually true, because there's only, you know, the water reservoirs keep going down. So if you're going to put it on your lawn, you're not going to have it to drink because that reservoir isn't filling up in the urban sector.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question on just local water use. In Irvine, the community where I live, the water system makes a big deal. I mean, most of Irvine is corporate owned and run by property concerns, but they recycle some water, and they have massive lawns, and they say, well, most of our water is used for landscaping, that they're only using recycled water, so it's okay to use. But theoretically, you could just put that back into the groundwater and use it for all uses, just clean it up a bit more. Is that a good assumption to make?
Yes, it is a good assumption to make. I will say, however, that the Irvine Water Company, I believe it is, has managed the water pretty well per capita. They have instead of charging people, there's a whole big issue about water how these water retailers are able to maintain their service, because they sell, sorry. So most retailers in water and electricity and so on, base their rates of return on volumetric water sales.
Mhm.
So if you reduce the amount of water that you're using, you have less return, which may seem okay, except that a lot of systems need money for infrastructure repair and maintenance and so on. So what they have been able to do down there is establish a different billing system, which is based on a household allocation budget. So they calculate a very sophisticated calculation of the number of people in the home, the size of the lot, and they allocate a certain amount of
Yes.
water to that place, which is a much more sophisticated way of maintaining your revenue. And surely, you can reduce the amount of water and increase the amount of recycling. The recycled water has to be treated much more extensively so that, you have to reduce the salts. There are a whole set of questions of contaminants in that water,
Yes,
which means that you have more infrastructure costs, right? There's no free lunch here in any way, so, but it's a very good question.
Yeah.
I was sort of wondering how Sigma is going, and just and more, I guess more broadly, having equal representation in what happens with water. Has that at all, has talk about that at all panned out into actual representation, or what tends to happen when you try to rebalance, I guess, who controls what happens with water?
Is that a question for Susana?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, great question, and I appreciate that. I think bottom line, whether it's Sigma or water boards or state water board or regulators, what really matters is having people that really do care to represent their constituents correctly. When you don't have that, decisions are made that don't help us. So when it comes to Sigma, the Groundwater Management Act, the goal of that was to ensure that we would plan now and for the future to ensure that we have a reliable source of drinking water for all stakeholders or all partners in the region. What is happening now is a lot of the GSAs, these agencies that are tasked to create these plans, well, first, the agency is made up of people that don't look like us, that don't represent our needs, that clearly don't want to talk about drinking water. And so what's happening, a lot of these plans are reflective of what we will say is complete genocide. They're not taking into consideration public water systems in their jurisdiction, which means they're not going to look plan for them now. So what we need to do is intervene and to provide feedback and to ensure that we're part of those discussions, right? And to ensure that these plans are not approved by DWR, because if they are, then we're not going to deliver on the Sigma law. And so we as advocates have to ensure that we're part of these letters, part of spaces, so that we bring about and we ensure that these plans reflect drinking water for now and the future. And to remind the Department of Water Resources that there's a lot of systems throughout the Central Valley that need to be taken into consideration for planning. So Sigma, as it stands right now, is to be determined how well it's going to be implemented. We see that it's not necessarily going to be successful if these plans are not inclusive and holistically reflective of the region's needs. We need water for drinking, not just for supply. And what you're going to see if you guys drive through the entire state of California, you're going to see a lot of propaganda that talks about supply. Farmers feed the country, and you know what they do. But we also need to talk about supply and water quality at the same time. When we have a drought team, guess what? Less water, less dilution of water, increased concentration of contaminants. Once again, the contaminants that we're dealing with are not friendly contaminants. They can get you really sick if you don't know what's in your drinking water. So I challenge all of us, because of the drought, it's changing everything. So check out your CCR report that you're supposed to receive every July, the Consumer Confidence Report. Every July, if you pay a water bill, you should look at it. That water quality report is going to tell you what kind of contaminants you had last year. But it gives you a good indication of what's happening now. And it's important that we understand that, because the drought, overpumping of groundwater is changing everything. So I can tell you, I don't know what kind of drinking water you have. I know what I have, and I don't drink mine. So it's important that we're all equipped with good information.
Any other questions? When we talked on the phone earlier, we were talking about can a city like Los Angeles become water resilient? And I would love you to talk a little more about that.
Sure. So I had the very good fortune to get a big NSF grant and other grants, and a really great team of people who are ecologists, hydrologists, engineers, and social scientists. And we asked the question, can LA become self-reliant in water? And we kind of excavated, what is the current water management system, including this whole question about groundwater management. Who has access to that groundwater? Even if it is adjudicated, which is a really big deal that doesn't occur. That's why SGMA exists, right? Because they haven't have these processes of legal decision of who gets how much water to maintain sustained yield. And what we found was the adjudications fixed those groundwater basins in time in terms of the amount that was in them and who got how much of the water. And traditionally the groundwater basins in LA were filled with Metropolitan Water District water when they began to become more low, and now that water isn't available. But in fact, because we've paved a lot of LA, the groundwater doesn't recharge as it used to, but there's a lot of capacity in those basins for a lot more water. And as I said earlier, the problem with those groundwater basins is they're not available for the residents of the county, which is kind of, goes back to what Susana was talking about. We're not managing this water for people. We're managing it for the water rights that certain groups have, right? So one of the things that we felt, or we determined, I'll use the right word, we determined scientifically, was that if you were to fill those groundwater basins to capacity and you managed them as a public water supply under a joint powers authority or something like that, they could become a very important buffer over time through dry periods, right? Fill up all the reservoirs, you reduce water consumption in the region to 40 gallons per person per day, up to 60 maybe in certain areas. You change outdoor landscaping, and you really manage the water very carefully. Most likely you could withstand water, you could not need water imports for around 10 years. And we know that there's a good likelihood of at least a few really good rains, really good precipitation in that period. You fill everything up to capacity, and then you again manage it, like a water, what are those things, the eyedropper, right? You think about your water in that manner, right? So it was an exercise in what if. Clearly it's probably a little bit more complicated than that. You recycle sewage sanitation water. You maximize that H2O drop in the region and manage it really, really carefully. Well, you could last a really long time without water imports. But we don't actually think of the water that way, and we have, as I said, this system of rules and regulations and rights, and the piping system makes it such that you actually create water scarcity in a situation where you don't really have a scarcity in that resource, at least in this region, which in the Central Valley is very different because, really the farmers are the ones who have created the crisis, right? They over-extract and they poison the groundwater. So, where's the problem? It's like kind of obvious, and they are the ones in control, as Susana was alluding to in a very polite way, of the whole SGMA system, right? They are on they're deciding amongst themselves who's going to get the water, and they fight like crazy anyway. It's going to take forever. I mean, this was 2014. Isn't there a water crisis? We're in 2022. What are they doing? Nothing's happened except arguing about who's going to get the right to pump more. So it's, anyway, that's.
Any last questions? I think we have no minutes left, but one last question.
How does the push for building more housing play into all of this?
Oh, I think that there's plenty of room for lots more housing. There's not enough room to continue to waste water. And we build, our urban fabric encourages excess water use. We are not talking about excess. We're talking about, oh, well, we're not gonna have enough. No, there are people who use way too much. And so if we begin to talk about excess, then there's plenty of room for everybody else. And Susana, by the way, is a rock star. I mean, honestly, your work it just moves me to tears, frankly. She's on the front line all the time. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate this conversation, team. I appreciate you all, and I think it's important that not only housing, but we have a chance to really redirect narrative. We have funding available that we're going to bring about innovative solutions. So we don't live in scarcity. A lot of our community partners, we're the best environmentalists and the water conservationists.
Yep.
So if you want to get to know a true water conservationist, come talk to directly with an impacted resident. You're not going to see them wasting any water.
Right.
And I can assure you this, a lot of their crops are glowing because we have nitrates in our drinking water. But again, we got to flip this story.
Yep.
We want to live in a California that is better for all of us, that's resilient. And it's going to be a key thing is to make sure that water is always humanized, that we work on water for people, not for extraction, not just for greed and money, but for humans. And that's the fight for us, is to ensure that water is, we're humans. All of us in this room need to thrive with safe drinking water. So we're all allies in this movement. And with that, I just want to say thank you, and please stay safe.
Thank all three of you. You guys were great, and this was a great panel. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.